Guten Tag and willkommen to my Germany vlog. This is episode 9, and this time we're going to be looking at the Weimar Constitution. Now, in the context of the depth study, this is the final part of the Weimar Constitution. And slightly strangely, hopefully you're aware that the depth topic only runs from 1917 to 1919. So everything that happens beyond 1919 up to depth topic 3 is not something you're expected to know. If you do know it, bonus, but they're not going to ask you questions expecting or ask you questions that where it is necessary to know stuff that happens in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. And that makes the Weimar Constitution a slightly kind of odd beast to assess because the consequences of the things that they put in place in the Constitution are things that we don't need to focus in on any detail. Nevertheless, we'll be assessing some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Constitution, and we'll also do a bit of comparison because I think the similarities, differences angle to the previous Constitution, the Bismarck's Constitution, the Kaiserreich Constitution of 1871, is quite helpful to consider. Anyhow, how did this constitution come about? Well, in January 1919, there were elections for a constituent assembly. This is under Friedrich Ebert's plan to found a new democracy based around Parliament and to kind of subvert the legitimacy of those councils, the workers' and soldiers' councils. This constituent assembly was devised in order to write the constitution. And actually, it was a pretty encouraging start for democracy in Germany. Over 75% of the electorate voted for either the SPD, the Centre Party, or the DDP, the Deutsche Democratic Party, the German Democrats. These were all pro-democracy, pro-Weimar Republic parties. And so they get to shape this constitution. The downside of that, I guess, is that they shape the Constitution thinking probably of themselves and their own reactions to it. And perhaps that's where some of the naivety of the Weimar Constitution comes from. The SPD were the biggest party in that election. They won 38% of the vote. And perhaps because of that, Friedrich Ebert is overwhelmingly endorsed as the first president of the Weimar Republic by this Constituent Assembly by 277 votes to 21. And so they get down to work pretty much straight away. And the Weimar Constitution is written in Weimar, not in Berlin, because of all the trouble that is happening in Berlin. Of course, the Spartacist uprising and then other uprisings, as we've talked about, and violence and unrest. And so they pull out of Berlin and go to Weimar, which is, I sort of think of it as kind of like the Oxford of Germany. That is a quieter town, a more learned town by a river. It's all quite peaceful. Anyhow, so they write the Constitution. Hugo Preuss is the key architect of this of the Constitution, and it's adopted in July 1919 overwhelmingly by the Assembly by 262 votes to 75. And it's at quick glance, it looks kind of similar to the Kaiserreich Constitution. So Germany remains a federal republic, this time only with 18 states, so they cut down on the number of states. And the federal system will work with the central government in Berlin being responsible for foreign affairs, army, taxation, communications, that sort of things. And the state Länder retain powers over education, police, the churches. It's similar to before. The head of state is no longer, of course, the Kaiser. Now it's going to be a president, and that president will be directly elected every 7 years, and they will have powers to appoint the chancellor, as with the Kaiser. They can call and dissolve the Reichstag, as with the Kaiser. They act as supreme commander of the armed forces, as with the Kaiser. And this time they get the special new power, the infamous Article 48, gave the president powers in an emergency to take power for themselves and to pass emergency legislation. Actually, there were stipulations that meant that the Reichstag could challenge those powers and that the Reichstag could in fact undo those decrees that were made when the emergency was over. But Article 48 becomes something that is used particularly by President Hindenburg from 1925 onwards to run Germany, not necessarily in an emergency, but when it's kind of more convenient to. And so if we do look ahead, we can see actually the number of decree laws to start with was fairly small, and even in 1930 there were only 5 Article 48 decree laws. That rose to 44 in 1931 and then 60 in 1932. So I guess you could argue that times were challenging towards the end of the era of the Weimar Republic, but clearly the response to that was to subvert democracy and rule by decree as a dictator. At the same time, the sittings of the Reichstag declined from 94 in 1930 to 41 in 1931 and 13 in 1932. And this is just kind of an indication of how Article 48 becomes this sort of thorn in the side of democracy in the Weimar Republic. So beyond that, there was the same sort of parliamentary setup, a bicameral system with two chambers, the lower one being the Reichstag. The Reichstag was elected every 4 years. It had powers to introduce and approve new laws, legislation. The Chancellor and the government this time had to have the support of the Reichstag. And if they didn't have support of the Reichstag, then they were expected to resign. And like before, the Reichstag was set up with representatives from all across Germany on the basis of a constituency being an area with 60,000 people living in it. This meant, of course, that representatives from Prussia had the most seats, but because Prussia, like anywhere else, had a number of different parties representing it, it didn't lead to the domination of Prussia. Probably the biggest change in the Reichstag was that they had the power to overrule the Reichsrat if 2/3 of the Reichstag agreed on something. So if there was a vote and 2/3 of the Reichstag voted for something, then nothing the Reichsrat could do, the upper house could do, could stop that law becoming a fact. The Reichsrat, the upper house then, was comprised of delegates representing the German states. According to population size, so the bigger the state, the more representatives they had. But no state was permitted to hold more than 40% of the seats, and that was to try and again limit the influence of Prussia, which it was felt had been a dominant force under Bismarck's constitution. And like before, the Reichsrat could veto legislation, but whereas before Prussia held a lock over that because he needed 17 votes. He needed 14 votes, and they had 17 delegates in the previous Reichsrat. In this time, you needed a majority in the Reichstag in order to veto legislation. And of course, as we said, the Reichstag can overrule that if they have a 2/3 majority. What that means in the Reichsrat is that Prussia no longer has that dominant influence that it had before, and that is a change, a deliberate change from the Kaiserreich constitution. These representatives to the Reichstag, not to the Reichsrat, to the Reichstag are voted by a franchise which now includes women, which is a change from before, and all men and all women over the age of 20 could vote in those elections. So it's very very democratic in that sense, and they voted on a system of proportional representation. What this means is that if a party won 2% of the vote, they got 2% of the seats in the Reichstag. If they won 25% of the vote, they got 25% of the seats in the Reichstag. It's a very pure form, a very democratic form of electing parties. But unfortunately, what it led to in the Weimar Republic, again famously, was a lot of parties getting seats. In fact, about 30 parties contested elections. And because there was no cut-off to how small your party could be before it got votes, it meant that all of these parties tended to get, or most of these parties tended to get votes. And what that led to was the necessity of coalition governments, which are not necessarily a bad thing, but coalition governments involving multiple parties become weaker and weaker. You have to hold together 4 or 5 parties in agreement. It's much harder than holding together 2 or even 3 parties in agreement. The other feature of the Weimar Constitution, which was considered to be very progressive at the time, was that the whole second half was a Bill of Rights, and these gave or guaranteed key civil liberties such as equality before the law, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, the right to belong to a trade union, and these were written down, of course, enshrined in law, which meant they couldn't be taken away, except that they could be taken away under Article 48. So if there was a time of emergency, then the president could suspend those civil rights and, for instance, allow the police to come and search your home without having a warrant or a particular cause for that. So the Constitution, good things, bad things. Well, if we talk about the strengths of the Constitution, it was great for providing those key civil rights. It was extremely democratic. It had this inbuilt safety valve if there was a crisis that could be used responsibly by the president to help with that. Also that an improvement on the previous constitution was that the Chancellor was both accountable to the Reichstag and had to resign if he didn't have the confidence of the Reichstag. On the other hand, the weaknesses, well, the two big weaknesses are things which perhaps couldn't be predicted in 1919, and they were that Article 48 was going to be abused, certainly misused, particularly by President von Hindenburg, although probably that's mostly because of the situation that he finds himself in. There are people, historians, who think that President Ebert overused the Article 48 too. And the other problem was that proportional representation led to a weak collection of coalitions during the 1920s. And the other potential problems, of course, were that in a federal system, the individual states could do their own thing, and it was hard to keep them on track in the same line. And that Article 48 could take away those rights that had been promised. And you see that actually with, as we will see in a couple of episodes' time, with the Reichstag fire decrees, where the rights of those communists are removed very quickly. And then finally, just to sort of recap similarities and differences from the Kaiserreich. Well, it's pretty easier to talk about the differences. First of all, women had the vote. The president was elected. There's no Kaiser. The Reichstag veto could be overcome by the Reichstag. Individual rights are written into the constitution. And Prussian influence is very restricted in a way that hadn't been before. On the other hand, the similarities actually are probably just as significant. It's still a federal system, it's the same setup. Reich law is still more important than state law. There are still two chambers in the parliament. The Reichstag is elected by the people. The Reichsrat still has a veto on legislation. And Prussia is still obviously the largest group in both the Reichsrat and, of course, represented most in the Reichstag because it's the biggest state. Probably one of the more sort of controversial similarities is between the Kaiser and the Chancellor. There are differences, of course, but they were so similar that at the time people called the president, between the Kaiser and the president was known as the Ersatz Kaiser, like the substitute Kaiser. Ersatz is spelled E-R-S-A-T-Z. And because he could appoint the Chancellor, he could dissolve the Reichstag, and he could rule like a dictator with Article 48, he was seen as being a powerful figure and kind of the most powerful figure in the German democratic system. And so there you have it, the Constitution. Was it more similar or more different from the Kaiserreich? Well, I would say actually that the similarities are perhaps more significant than the differences. But the differences are what make the difference to the Weimar Republic not working. And what were the consequences of the Weimar Constitution? Well, you probably won't get a question about this, but the consequences of the Weimar Constitution were that democracy was implemented in Germany, but that democracy was implemented in a way that was flawed in Germany. I hope that makes sense. It's quite a rattle through quite a lot of details there, but hopefully that's useful. And I'll see you next time when we will think a little bit about the rise to power of Hitler.